The streets were transformed into glistening waterways of reflected light, as the rain continued to fall relentlessly that evening, a steady drumming against the roof. I had always found the sound of rain to be calming, as it obscured the boundaries of the world and made everything feel more intimate and tranquil. However, that evening, the rain seemed to serve as a backdrop to an event for which I was unprepared. As I stood in my kitchen, negligently drying the dishes, the doorbell rang. It was too late for any unforeseen visitors. Mark, my spouse, had departed earlier in the evening for a weekend business retreat, leaving me alone at home. I briefly experienced a sense of unease. However, upon peering through the peephole, I exhaled with relief. Mark's closest companion was Adam. Adam had been a fixture in our lives for nearly 2 decades. Mark and he had been inseparable ever since they had met in college. He was a consistent presence at our family gatherings, barbecues, and game evenings. He was the only individual I could rely on to arrive unannounced at this late hour. However, the manner in which he stood beneath the porch light, with rain dripping from his dark hair, elicited a sense of inquiry in me. The door was opened by me. "Adam, what are you doing in this location?" His blue eyes were alight with an inexplicable flicker, despite his reserved demeanor. He stated I did not intend to simply drop by, as he buried his hands in the pockets of his damp jacket. However, I was on my way home and he stumbled, his mandible clenching. I required a conversation with an individual. His voice was unusually vulnerable, with an unfamiliar weight. Adam was typically the life of the party, known for his quick wit and effortless charisma. His dubious and hesitant demeanor caused me to feel uneasy. I gestured for you to enter, stepping aside. He hesitated for a brief moment before entering. I observed that his shoulders sagged slightly as he shook off his jacket, as if he were carrying a weighty object. I suggested that I retrieve a towel for you as I proceeded to the hallway wardrobe. He was absorbed in thought as he stood in the living room, gazing out the rain-spattered window when I returned. I presented him with the towel, and he quietly expressed his gratitude before rinsing it through his moist hair. "Would you like a cup of coffee?" I inquired in an effort to alleviate any tension that may have been present. He nodded and I occupied myself in the kitchen, appreciative of the opportunity to engage in a task. The air between us was dense with an unspoken substance as the coffee brewed. I was uncertain as to whether I should inquire ahead of time or wait for him to speak. Eventually, he exhaled forcefully as I placed a mug in front of him. He said, his fingers clenching around the ceramic, "I have been keeping something inside for a long time, and I don't think I can anymore." I sat across from him, my innards contracting. "What is it?" He hesitated, gazing into his coffee as if it contained the answers he was seeking. He then stated, "I am in love with you, Claire," in a quiet, nearly shattered voice. Despite the fact that the only sound in the room was the rain, the words settled between us like a thunderclap. My breath caught in my throat as I blinked. Of all the things I had anticipated him to say, this was not one of them. I briefly entertained the possibility that I had misunderstood him. It is possible that the storm outside had distorted his words. However, the raw, unguarded manner in which he looked at me left no room for misinterpretation. "Adam," I initiated the conversation, however I was unsure of the intent of my words. "I am aware," he interrupted, shaking his head. "I am aware of the way this sounds. I am aware of the significance of this. However, I am unable to maintain my facade any longer." I experienced a sensation of heat rising up my face, which was a combination of astonishment and an unidentified sensation. Adam had consistently been Mark's closest companion. He had also been my friend perpetually. However, I had never entertained the notion of considering anything beyond that. I inquired, "Have you been consuming alcohol?" in an effort to ascertain an explanation. A laugh that was devoid of amusement was released by him. "I regret that I am unable to attribute the cause to that. I wish that this were an issue that I could disregard tomorrow, however, it is not. Claire, it is genuine. I forced myself to swallow forcefully, my fingertips firmly grasping the table's edge. Adam, you are not permitted to make statements of that nature. He stated. I am obligated to as he leaned forward. Why? Because it is the truth, and I have no expectation of you. I assure you that I do not. However, I required your knowledge, as feigning it does not diminish its authenticity. My pulse was thundering in my ears as I shook my head. This was excessive. Too abrupt. Mark and I had established an existence together, despite the fact that my marriage was not flawless. We possessed a foundation, recollections, and history. All of that was at risk of being appended by Adam's confession. I exhaled deeply. I am uncertain as to what you anticipate me to say. He acknowledged that there is nothing to anticipate. Nevertheless, I was unable to contain it any longer. The atmosphere between us was fraught with an unspoken sense of tension. I could discern the longing in his eyes, the subdued desperation of an individual who had clung to something for an excessive amount of time. In that instant, I sensed a stirring within me, a recurrence of an emotion that I had previously refrained from acknowledging. However, acknowledging it would result in a complete transformation. Additionally, I was uncertain as to whether I was adequately prepared for that circumstance. The silence between us was dense, unyielding, and elongated. The sole sound was the rhythmic ticking of the wall clock and the persistent rain that lashed the windows. My mind was in a state of disarray as it attempted to comprehend the information that Adam had admitted. It was as though the air had been extracted from the room. He murmured, rubbing his face with his hand, I should not have said anything. It is probable that I have caused irreparable damage. I steadily shook my head, although I was uncertain as to what I was denying. The truth behind his words or the impact they were having on me. The intensity of my heartbeat was so intense that it appeared as though it might penetrate my ribs. No, I murmured. You have not caused any damage. He lifted his gaze to examine my features. Proceed to articulate your thoughts. Anything. I swallowed, feeling the weight of the moment bearing down on me. Adam, you are the closest friend of my spouse. You have been a part of our existence for an extended period. I never ever imagined that you would feel this way. The chuckle he released was low and devoid of amusement. This is due to the fact that I never permitted you to view it. I ignored it. For many years. Are you aware of the extent to which that has been challenging? His fingertips gripped the coffee mug as if it were the only thing keeping him steady, and his voice was quiet but resonant with emotion. I was unsure of how to respond. I was tempted to inform him that his emotions were misguided, but that would be a fabrication. I had observed his gaze occasionally, which was extended beyond what was necessary, as if he were attempting to memorize me. I had simply never permitted myself to query it. I steadily exhaled. Adam, I have a deep affection for Mark. I am aware. He attempted to emit a faint smile, but it failed to register in his pupils. That is the reason I refrained from uttering a word. That is why I convinced myself that I could tolerate it. However, Claire, I am uncertain of late. It is becoming increasingly challenging. I attempted to think clearly by pressing my fingertips to my temple. Why at this time? Why disclose this information to me tonight? He hesitated, then exhaled. For the reason that I observed you at the grocery store earlier today. The cashier's statement caused you to chuckle, and for a brief moment, you appeared to be exceedingly pleased. And I pondered, what if that had been my life? What if I had informed her earlier? I experienced a sensation of constriction in my thorax. Adam, I murmured. He smiled at me with a melancholy expression. I recognize that it is self-serving and I do not anticipate that you will share my sentiments. However, I was unable to continue to maintain my facade. I required your knowledge. I gazed at him, my emotions in a state of turmoil. A portion of me yearned to terminate this conversation, to inform him that we would never discuss this matter again. However, another aspect of me, the one that was deeply repressed and never acknowledged, experienced a stirring. Unexpectedly, a memory resurfaced. Years ago, Adam and I had shared a moment, brief and fleeting, but genuine, prior to Mark and my marriage. It was on one of those summer nights when we were all younger, before life had settled into routines and responsibilities. Adam and I had remained behind, conversing for hours on the porch swing, the air dense with an unspoken emotion, as Mark had departed the party early. Nothing had transpired. No words were ever spoken. However, I recalled the manner in which he had regarded me that evening. Had I heard anything at that time? Had I interred something in the same manner as he had? I shook my head, as if to alleviate the burden of my own thoughts. Adam, this is a significant amount of information to absorb. I am aware. He abruptly rose from his seat and ran his hand through his hair. I should leave. I refrained from stopping him. He reached for his outerwear and proceeded to the entrance. However, as he reached for the handle, he abruptly reversed direction. Claire, I intended to convey my sentiments. I will remain present, even if it is only as a friend, regardless of what transpires. I forced a hard intake and nodded in agreement. Adam, good night. He hesitated for a mere fraction of a second before opening the door and stepping into the downpour. I stood there for an extended period of time after he departed, gazing at the closed door with my heart still pounding. And I was aware that I would never be able to forget what he had said in my heart. That evening, I was unable to obtain adequate sleep. Adam's words reverberated in my consciousness like an echo that I was unable to silence every time I closed my eyes. I was unable to continue to maintain my facade. I required your knowledge. I assured myself that it did not alter anything. I was married to Mark, and we had established a life that was both stable and comfortable. However, despite my efforts to persuade myself, a part of me was aware that the situation would not be the same after tonight. The storm had dissipated by morning, leaving behind damp streets and the refreshing aroma of new rain. Mark was already awake, seated at the kitchen table with his laptop open and his coffee in hand. He said, "Good morning," without glancing up. I pondered if he could detect the exhaustion in my voice, as it was hoarse in the morning. I occupied myself with the preparation of coffee, attempting to avoid his gaze. I was internally agitated, despite the fact that my hands were steadfast. Is it advisable to inform him? Would that facilitate the process? Mark finally glanced up as I poured his coffee. His brow slightly furrowed. "Are you feeling well?" I forged a modest grin. "I simply did not slumber well." He nodded, his attention already diverted by his emails. Although it was so ordinary, so mundane, it was the first time that I felt as though a barrier existed between us. One that had never been present before. I was repelled by this. I devoted the remainder of the day to attempting to forget Adam's confession. I completed errands, responded to emails, and even contacted an acquaintance in order to hear a familiar voice. However, my thoughts were unable to escape the events of the previous evening, regardless of the actions I took. The weight in Adam's voice, the way he had gazed at me, and the way my heart had reacted to spite myself. I was aware that I could no longer avoid it by the late afternoon. I paused for an extended period of time before eventually composing a message after grabbing my phone. Could we engage in conversation? Immediately, the 3 small specks appeared. Then his response was received. Adam. Certainly. What is the time and location? I gazed at the screen, feeling my innards contort. I was aware that I could not leave matters unresolved, but meeting him felt like crossing a line. The cemetery. 6 o'clock. Adam. I will be present. At the time of my arrival, the park was exceptionally tranquil. The air was cool and crisp as a result of the rain, and the grass was still wet beneath my shoes. Adam's expression was inscrutable and his hands were buried in his pockets when I observed him standing near a bench. He offered a small, cautious smile as I approached. Greetings. Greetings. I sat beside him, ensuring that we maintained a respectful distance. Neither of us spoke for a brief period. Heavy and uncertain, the silence extended. I then exhaled deeply. Adam, I am at a loss for words. His gaze was fixated on the small pond in front of us, and he nodded. I comprehend the situation. I gazed downward at my hands. Last night you caught me off guard. I had no clue, you know. I have never desired for you to do so. He quietly exhaled. Claire, I had no intention of uttering a word. However, upon doing so, it was as though I could finally exhale after years of constriction. Turning toward him, I examined his visage. However, why is it now? What is the reason for not doing so prior to Mark and my marriage? Why was it not implemented when it could have had a significant impact? His lips formed a narrow line. Because I believed that I could manage it at the time. I believed I could be nothing more than your friend. However, it became increasingly challenging as time progressed. Additionally, I am uncertain. Perhaps it is self-serving, but I was unable to maintain my facade. For a brief period, I shut my eyes. You are aware that this alters the situation, correct? He agreed. I am aware. The lump in my esophagus was ingested. Adam, I cherish my spouse. Softly, he exhaled. I am aware. And I am unable to. I will not take any action that could cause him harm. He smiled at me with a melancholy expression. I would never request that you do so. With a heavy heart, I turned my gaze away. Consequently, what is the implication of this? Before he ultimately spoke, he was silent for an extended period. Claire, that decision is entirely yours. I wished to inform him that nothing had changed and that we could return to the previous state of affairs. However, in my heart, I was aware that it was a fabrication. Due to an alteration. I was uncertain about the significance of the statement at the time, but I was certain that my perspective on Adam would never be the same after tonight. I was frightened by that. I drove home in silence, the weight of Adam's conversation pressing on my chest like a weighty stone. My mind was a tumult of emotions, guilt, sorrow, and an additional emotion that I was unable to articulate. I had believed for years that I was aware of my position in my life, marriage, and alliances. However, the events of tonight have disturbed the very foundation of my convictions. The sky had darkened by the time I arrived at the driveway, and the house was illuminated by the interior lights. Mark was at home. Before entering, I hesitated briefly. The living room was filled with the familiar sound of the television, and the fragrance of his cologne lingered in the air. He was sitting on the sofa, enjoying a beer, and appeared to be at ease. He glanced at me and said, "Hey, what was your location?" Although the inquiry was informal, I experienced a brief moment of unease. I hesitated despite the fact that I had nothing to conceal. I took a stroll through the park. It was not a fabrication, however, it was not entirely accurate either. Mark nodded, not giving it much consideration. Has it been a long day? I inhaled. Yes. He cushioned the settee adjacent to him. Please join me for a seat. I approached and took a seat, savoring the comfort of his company. We remained seated for a brief period, with the television's sound emanating from the space between us. And that was the moment when it dawned on me. This we was genuine. This was the life I had constructed and the man I had selected. And despite the unexpected confession that had sparked a deep-seated emotion within me, this was the sole location I desired to be in the past 24 hours. I turned to Mark, observing the lines of his face and the slight furrow in his brow as he watched the screen in concentration. Despite the fact that I had spent an inordinate amount of time with him, I experienced a sensation of reconnection with him tonight. He must have detected my gaze as he abruptly raised an eyebrow and turned his head. What is the matter? I offered a gentle look. Nothing. I simply want to express my affection for you. The abrupt tenderness in my voice caught him off guard, causing his expression to shift. After that, his expression became more gentle, and he extended his hand toward me. Claire, I also cherish you. I closed my eyes and rested my head against his shoulder. My heart had already belonged to someone, regardless of the events that had transpired with Adam or the emotions that had arisen. Additionally, this sufficed. Adam departed for an overseas business project a week later. Before departing, he conveyed a brief message to me. "Claire, Adam, please be well. I will be available at all times to assist you." I contemplated the message for an extended period of time before deciding to respond. "Who am I? Are you also in agreement?" "Adam," I was uncertain as to whether or not the situation would ever return to its previous state. However, it may have been acceptable. Life had a tendency to astonish us and to put the fortitude of the decisions we made to the test. In the end, it was not about the unspoken remarks or the untraveled paths. It was about the love we chose each and every day. The conclusion: the story's just beginning. There are more broken hearts and dark secrets ahead. Hit like, subscribe, and keep exploring with Love Missteps.